Thank you to everyone. Thank you for the organizers. So historically, one could suppose. Well, if I were a spokesman for the People's Republic of China, I would of course begin in time immemorial. Of course, I'm not going to go back that far. I do want to go back to the Qing dynasty, though, to the Qing Empire, because as many of you may know, when the Qing Empire conquered the region that is now known as Xinjiang or East Turkestan, it administered it with a, you could call it pluralistic system. It's not democratic pluralism, but it was a system that had a variety of administrative and legal means in place, structures in place to rule the different peoples, right? So beys for Uyghurs, there were Mongol princes for Mongols, there was a version of the system, the Jin system from China proper, for those Chinese people who moved in and so on. So their approach to what the political scientists would call heteronomy, or sort of ruling over others like this, was a kind of imperial pluralism, a sort of top-down multiculturalism. And it worked. Without going into the whole 100-year history of Xinjiang, for the most part, actually, it was quite peaceful. The population increased, the economy flourished. This is what empires, when done right, can do. They can actually manage difference in a way that, ironically enough, nation states often have a problem doing because of the ideas of nationalism. Okay, so click on ahead to the Minghua period. Very, very quickly, those governors / warlords who were able to rule for a fairly long time in that period did so with a similar kind of pluralist system. Those that tried to create a uniform or Chinese-style system, and blew up horribly in their faces. And our colleague Justin Jacobs over at AU has written a really nice book about Yang Zengxi, the governor there, which makes this very, very clear. Balancing with different kinds of pluralistic systems worked in that period from 1911 through 1949. All right, so when the PRC assumed control over the territory, they faced similar sorts of issues, and of course they had an ideological problem similar to that of the Soviet Union, in that how do you inherit an empire when you are ideologically opposed to imperialism, right? It's a tough thing to balance out. So as you know, the way the Soviet Union did it was by creating a union of republics, right? They were a multinational state like this. And the PRC superficially, well, the PRC more than superficially, did a very similar sort of thing. It wasn't entirely taking the Soviet model, although they had a good example of that model from Xinjiang, where that kind of administration of different ethnicities and the top-down recognition of Minzu had begun already in the 1930s, right, under Sheng Shicai. So Xinjiang was actually the first part of what the PRC would claim to be China, where the Minzu system was implemented, almost more than 10 years before 49. In any case, they had a version of that, as you know, and from this, of course, we get the famous 56 nationalities of China, or ethnicities, as this word Minzu is sometimes translated. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I fully welcome cries of disbelief and opposition if I say this, but that this system of pluralism in the People's Republic of China was broadly popular when it was implemented. So in the Cultural Revolution, it was definitely not. But overall, it was more popular than possible alternatives. In other words, Han chauvinism, or outright attempts to assimilate people to be some kind of Chinese nationality. The difference between the Soviet Union, or one difference between the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, is in the name. The Soviet Union was not Russia. There was a lot of great Russianism still there. It was Russia-centric, certainly, and you can argue that. But they didn't have the problem of having the same name as the former empire, which of course China does. So that is one of the differences. But one of the things that the Minzu system did from 1949, with the exception of the Cultural Revolution, really up until the 90s or early 2000s, or wherever we want to see it sort of eroding. What it did was to to recognize and give status to different ethnicities besides the Han, and to normalize that fact that there were multiple ethnicities, right? It's on the Shenfenzhen, it's on the ID card. And yes, there's all of the singing and dancing and the literature and the stuff which Western observers see as somewhat kitschy often, but that nonetheless is giving value to a non-Han identity. And I think, again, I'm stepping out a little bit on the limb here, but I think many Minzu would have recognized that and valued that. All right. The Soviet Union fell apart in 1991. One prominent stream of interpreting what happened to it in China was that it fell apart because of ethno-nationalism. Right now, here we'll argue about that, and we'll say economic factors and the Cold War and everything else was a bigger factor. But that's one explanation that really took hold among policymakers and thinkers in China. And so around about 2005, a debate began in China policy circles and among anthropologists, and even openly on the internet, as to whether the Minzu system itself in China was a liability. Was this going to create the kind of ethno-national divides that then China would fall apart around? This debate picked up greatly, and it was amplified after 2008 with the riots in Tibet, and then in 2009 after the riots and their aftermath in Urumqi, and continued really right up through the early 2012, 2015 period. Now, around that time, a couple of spokesmen came forward. One, some of you may have heard of, was an anthropologist, Ma Rong. A couple others, Hu Lianhe and Hu Anggang from the Tsinghua Strategic Studies unit, began to write openly about they needed that China needed a new Minzu system, one that was non-politicized, by which they meant taking away the so-called territorial set-asides. They proposed substituting a melting pot idea for hors d'oeuvres style Minzu, like this. And this debate, there were a lot of people pushing back, obviously, through the whole, the Minzu committee. If you think about, this whole system is deeply structurally built into Chinese administration, right? It goes all the way from the bottom to the top in various ways. And so it's not something that could easily be just extracted from the Chinese government. So there's a lot of pushback back and forth. 2014, Xi Jinping convened the Central Ethnic Work Conference. He actually had many meetings where these sorts of issues came up and he talked about them. He gave a speech there which had some material from both sides of the debate, but I think in retrospect, we look back, he was really laying a very clear signal where he wanted to take things. He highlighted, for example, cultural identity as the basis for strengthening the Chinese nation, and contrasted spiritual concerns with material concerns. Right? So the material concern argument meant that if we the idea that raising standards of living would eventually make restive minorities happy. Right? Well, that had clearly not been the case, at least from the viewpoint from Beijing. And so he's saying, no, the spiritual side as well as the material side needs to be the focus of our party policy. He also talked about one of these sort of numerical slogans, very popular in Chinese politics, the 4 identifications. And this is that all Minzu in China need to identify with the motherland, they need to identify with the Chinese nation, they need to identify with Chinese culture, and they need to identify with the socialist road with Chinese characteristics. So that's a lot of Chinese, a lot of Zhonghua, right, in that formulation. So, to sum this up then, the new emerging argument around 2014 and 15 was that economic development was clearly not a panacea for ethnic problems. Rather, interethnic mingling, so jiaorong, this is a term that started being used much more, and even fusion would be required. Now, back in the 80s, the sort of ethnicity policy and sort of academic world were very fond of an old anthropologist named Fei Xiaotong. And Fei Xiaotong had written a formulation of the relationship between the Zhonghua, or the Chinese Minzu, with the 56. And he said that the Zhonghua Minzu was the constellation, the crystallization of the identity of the 56 other Minzu. And it was a kind of an idea that you could have a high-level identity and a lower-level identity, and they weren't contradictory with each other. Right? So it's more or less an anthropological kind of approach. Right? He essentialized Minzu identity in a way that anthropologists would disagree with now, but basically said that you could be Chinese and Uyghur. Right? Now, just the other day, a white paper was released about the Xinjiang issue, along with press statements in Xinhua and Global Times. There's some really interesting language in there. They talk continually that Zhonghua Minzu is the root or the source, that Chinese civilization is the foundation of the other Minzu, and makes it clear from their very, very brief historical section that the new argument that they're putting forward is that the 56 Minzu grew out of some ancient fundamental Chinese Minzu. And it's kind of deviated from the norm, but they can be brought back home. And this is an argument that Chiang Kai-shek made actually back in the 30s in his book, China's Destiny, right? So they flipped that pyramid over in the argument now, and they're trying to say that Zhonghua is the ancient Minzu from which others have deviated. And this, of course, is perfectly in accord with other propaganda that we've seen. For example, the Ruchi Mayer's infamous article that Uyghurs have nothing to do with the Turkic people; they're just Chinese people, right? Right. This is so obviously contrary to fact, right? But a lot of research on Zhonghua Minzu and people arguing that Uyghur language, obsequious scholars or scholars trying to stay out of jail, out of prison, arguing that Uyghur language is derived from Han language. Some people have even tried to take that. Someone showed me an article, right? So that's where we are. So I'm almost done. All of this is really ironic because although the idea of brainwashing, of changing identity, of changing thinking by intervention of the state, this is an older idea, right? There are continuities with this. We've seen it in Falun Gong, approaches to Falun Gong. We see it in Maoism, right? And arguably there's some of that even in Confucian thinking as well. So that is, to a certain degree, traditional. What is not traditional at all is this assimilationist approach to difference. It runs against the very pragmatic forms of top-down multiculturalism, which we've seen in the PRC period. We saw it in here and there in the Mingguo period. We certainly saw it in the Qing. That's what all the New Qing history, those of you who follow those academic debates, that's what that's about. That's why New Qing history, when people cottoned onto it, became so sensitive, because it was arguing. And I could take this back through previous dynasties too, despite the argument about sinification, that people magically became Chinese. If you're going to talk about there being a magical phenomenon going back through ancient times in China that converts non-Chinese, that's an admission that there are lots of non-Chinese around there to be converted for millennia, right? So the diversity and multiculturalism of China is there all along, and Chinese states have always dealt with it, usually in quite practical ways. And now we're seeing a complete reversal of that traditional Chinese approach to multiculturalism.
Thank you very much, Professor Millward, for that very eloquent outline of the changes that have occurred in recent years. I'd like to invite Sandrine Kachis from Augusta University up to speak to us, I think, about the Cultural Revolution.
Down the bottom.
Oh, right here. Thank you, everyone. I should stand for. I'm used to moving around and I can't today. Thank you, everyone, for coming today, and thank you to Sean and to all of my colleagues for organizing this conference and very important symposium. So I was asked to talk about the Cultural Revolution and how it compares or not to what is happening today in the Uyghur homeland, or Xinjiang. I know it's not a term that people like, but I think that because Xinjiang is definitely a colonial space, it is an appropriate term to use. I agree with Timothy on that. I will talk about these images a little later, so, but here you can recognize Mao Zedong and Xi Jinping being benevolent rulers. So why think about the Cultural Revolution during the Maoist period and what's happening today in Xinjiang? Why are people wanting to make this comparison? In 2017, October 2017, that was one of the first times that one of my Uyghur friends who lives in North America mentioned this comparison to me, and she said, this is even worse than the Cultural Revolution. It's very similar, but it is worse. Because during the Cultural Revolution, people had to do self-criticism, but then they could go home and kind of more or less lead normal lives. And clearly, as you've heard from the presentations of all the scholars earlier today, it is very difficult to lead somewhat normal lives today in the region. One of the other reasons that people want to think about the Cultural Revolution and the de-extremification campaign that is ongoing today together is because the Cultural Revolution until recently seemed to have been one of the worst things, right, that had happened in the PRC. As James mentioned, Jim Miller mentioned, when the CCP sort of overthrew the Kuomintang, won the civil war, and began this sort of classification of all the different Minzu, it is true that many actually welcomed that new way of rule because everything that had preceded had been quite terrible. But I see the Cultural Revolution as, in many ways, one of many of the campaigns that existed after the founding of the People's Republic of China that tried to really make the argument that Xinjiang had been part of China since time immemorial, which of course is not true. There wasn't a Xinjiang since time immemorial, even less a China. Oh, and that's very controversial, I guess. So the Cultural Revolution has been talked about as one of Mao's last revolution, Mao's 30% of mistake, that's sort of the party understanding of it. And for the region, it was definitely, for the Uyghur region, it was definitely the end of any kind of possible sort of acceptance in some ways of the Chinese state as a legitimate ruler of the region, at least for Uyghur activists in the diaspora. In fact, many of the memoirs of the Cultural Revolution, even before the current campaign, that talked about the Cultural Revolution often portray it as evidence that Chinese rule in the region is not legitimate, right? So in Xinjiang, or in the Uyghur homeland, government and party authorities did not really agree on what should happen. There was actually a lot of factionalism, and that was fairly evident that they kept sort of changing their minds on what they could allow the Red Guards and Min Beings to do in the region. Should we allow Red Guards from Beijing to come to the region? And if they did come, how could we convince them not to go to regions that were too close to the borders, or into Uyghur, in parts of the region that were too Uyghur, because they feared ethnic unrest. The Red Guards in the region, there were local Red Guards that were both Uyghur, Kazakh, and Han Chinese, and many other of the many ethnic groups that exist in the region. And there were also outside Red Guards from Navy. And they were told to destroy the four worlds, just like they were told to do this in other parts of the PRC. But when they came to the Uyghur homeland, a lot of the four worlds were not traditionally Han Chinese four worlds, but actually many of the traditions that were attacked were Uyghur customs or Kazakh customs, religious Islamic practice. And I'll come, and for the sake of time, I will look at religion, education, as how they compare to what's happening today in the region. So while there wasn't assimilation in the way that there is today, I would say that there was a tendency in the 1960s, and then with the beginning of the Cultural Revolution in mid-1966, to actually push for some, oh, it's not showing, sorry, to push for some assimilation in some ways. But so here's a booklet of the new writing system that they tried to impose in the Uyghur region on the Uyghur language, the Yengi Yizik. And basically here, what you see, of course, are the image of Mao, and then a young Uyghur man teaching an older Uyghur man how to read the new language. And I think that reminds me of some of the things that people have talked about, what's happening today where you have all these young children now who are separated from their families, but even the ones who are not separated from their families are forced to go through sort of this Han Chinese education in the Chinese language. So back then they could still learn and read in their own native tongue. However, the content of textbooks was very sort of ideologically based, and in part trying to convince Uyghurs that they were Chinese citizens, but also trying to convince Han Chinese that that Uyghurs were Chinese citizens, right? And I think that's something where the state never quite succeeded in doing this. Since 1949, the region has been very integrated into China, right? It's very difficult to imagine, unfortunately for some, that the region could ever be an independent country. Of course, those things can happen, right? The example of the Soviet Union is a good parallel. However, it seems so integrated today that it seems hard, but since 1949, right, it has been a big part of it, and the state hasn't been able to fully convince everyone. Clearly, there's a lot of sort of prejudice or racism from Han Chinese toward Uyghurs, at least the ones who live in the region. There is, we've all heard that Uyghurs are backward, that Uyghur traditions are backward, that Uyghurs are terrorists, right? We've heard a lot of prejudice like this. And so I think there is a lack of sort of success on the part of the state to convince people of this sort of parallel. Now, when it comes to religion, during the Cultural Revolution, really during the Red Guard phase of it especially, I think that's the part of it where religious practice was truly restricted from from August of '66 to late 1968. Most of the mosques we know were closed. Several of them were repurposed. Joanne talked about mosques being turned into a coffee and a bar. Back then, we know that they were either closed and sort of ignored but surveilled, or used as for animals and for sort of storage, right? So basically, sort of somewhat like a humiliation, right, of and a disrespect to religious practice. And so here is a picture of the Hoja main mosque, and what you see, you can't see the full picture, but basically it's padlocked, right? The gate is padlocked. It was Ramadan, so of course nobody could go to the mosque, but people cannot go to the mosque before or after anyway. And then you see the barbed wire. And so during the Cultural Revolution, for example, we know for sure that Itka was attacked by Red Guards. Probably several of them were Uyghurs actually, and they took down the crescent, the moon crescent, from the top of Itka. And actually, the government stepped in, saying, "This is a cultural space that has a historical space that needs to be saved." And so they limited, right, the damage done to Itka, because Itka is sort of this very important sort of monument in some ways. But they allowed destruction for the smaller mosques. During the Cultural Revolution, people were imprisoned, right? And so, but who was imprisoned? It was a variety, right? It wasn't just Uyghurs or Kazakhs. So it wasn't only Turkic people. Several people who were considered to be sort of untrustworthy or disloyal to Mao were imprisoned. And that the reasons were often fairly bogus. when you read some of the stories from the Cultural Revolution, and especially from Turkic people during the Cultural Revolution, there's only two that I know of who wrote memoirs about it. One of the memoirs by Soyungur Chanishef. She wrote The Land Drenched in Tears, where she talks about her experience with imprisonment. And I was struck yesterday listening to the different sort of descriptions of what imprisonment looks like today in the internment camps, to how similar it was. The overcrowded space, the sort of humiliation that as a woman, for example, you couldn't wash as much as you wanted, having to share space sometimes even with men, having to share blankets. And, like, it's so similar, it's actually kind of frightening. This is an image from what I believe, I'm not sure that's what it is, but there's so many different kinds of detention centers, right? It's hard to know what kind this one is. It might be one for short-term imprisonment, but basically it's an old hospital. It's just right down the street from the mosque that I just showed you, that has probably been converted into a camp. Or what do I know? There's a gigantic police station in front of it. I don't know if you can tell, but they are like, you can't walk on the sidewalk in front of it anymore. And all of the windows have sort of a thick metal sheet, you know, to cover up. And there's of course a lot of sort of propaganda about education and Xinjiang walking into sort of the future and being modern. And these are the same, fairly similar kinds of rhetorics that happened during the Cultural Revolution, right? Of moving forward, getting rid of old feudal ideas, old bourgeois ideals to bring China into the future. Now, the future they imagined during the Maoist period was a socialist future, where everyone would be happy. It was a somewhat sort of positive message in some ways, but here it's more dystopian in many ways, I would say, than what happened during the Cultural Revolution. And as I said, during the Cultural Revolution, many people were attacked. Who? For example, cadres that somehow had angered Beijing. So actually all of the people who were Han Chinese or Uyghur cadres who were arrested and were jailed for 8 to 10 years tended to be people who did not support Wang and Mao, which is kind of interesting because even after Wang and Mao, who was the governor of the region during the Cultural Revolution, was removed from power, these people were still imprisoned, and some of them only came out like Wu Guang after the death of Mao Zedong, right? So clearly, political, you know, we would think that political affiliation had something, you know, that being against Wang and Mao would be good for you, but actually it wasn't. So here's an image, two short photos, and like someone just sent me a scan of a bunch of these small photos, so it's not a very good quality. But Burhan Shahidi and Liu Jianren, right? Burhan Shahidi, who had worked for the Kuomintang before liberation, but I've been allowed to stay. And he wrote a memoir about his experience in living in Xinjiang. However, all about the Cultural Revolution, all he said was that it was a very sort of chaotic time, which is sort of the typical sort of way of talking about the Cultural Revolution. We talked a lot about how Uyghurs today and other Turkic groups in the region feel the need to demonstrate that they're loyal to the state. During the Cultural Revolution, they had to demonstrate that they were loyal to Mao and to socialist ideals. And one of the ways they did this was by sort of moderating and paying attention to what they said, right? So just like today, people do not say Assalamu alaikum anymore. Back then, they stopped saying this, and actually several of the memoirs mentioned it, and felt the need to sort of shout out political slogans when they met each other. Either the very easy Mao Zhuxi Wan Sui, long live Chairman Mao, or let's take down our class enemies, you know, and, you know, one of the memoirs by Abdurrashid Karimi actually mentions how people were trying to gauge what faction people were in because they were so afraid of saying the wrong thing to the wrong person because people were watching each other, right? Just like today, the surveillance states that exist today in the region functions because, of course, the great technological advances that allow the state to be so invasive But back then, but it also relies on people denouncing their neighbors, right? And why do you denounce your neighbors? Sometimes it's because you're trying to not be arrested, right? So the same kind of dynamics seem to exist. So the modification of language. If you see during the 1960s in particular, a lot of Chinese words came in the Uyghur language, like in publications, right? But of course that did not work out, right? Because as soon as the Cultural Revolution was over, those words were kind of purged out. Other kinds of behaviors were also monitored, so people did not feel free to dance a traditional dance, at least during the Red-Guard phase of the Cultural Revolution. It was not as strict afterwards, but they felt sort of they couldn't perform like traditional Uyghur dance. They had to perform the loyalty dance to Mao and sing "The East is Red." Today, what do they sing? You guys mentioned it, right? They sing all these patriotic songs, right? So there's so many parallels, right? But the content was a little more socialist, though it was also nationalist during this period. There are other ways that people mark their loyalty to the state. So today, if you go to the region, you will notice that on people's door, people have sort of these badges. They have, they are a good family, right? They're a Minzu Tuanje family. They have all these things that can be marked on their door as people who can be somewhat trusted. During the Cultural Revolution, having images of Mao Zedong all over the place was one of the ways that you could show that you love Mao. Having his, at least 3 volumes, if not more, of his collected works. Of course, the little red books, right, where all these things that people felt they needed to do as a way of protecting themselves. And I think today, smoking or drinking, with the Han cadres who come visit you might be one way that you mark loyalty, or that you mark that you are not, that you can be trusted. Inviting tourists, Han Chinese tourists, into your homes and showing them hospitality, right, is one way that you can show that you are actually truly loyal to the state and that you love China. And there are many others that could be mentioned. So these are 2 images. So what I noticed, during the Cultural Revolution, images throughout the country, right, of Mao Zedong were everywhere, right? And there were lots of stories of how, common Uyghur folks, even a poor farmer from Turpan, loved Mao, right? That allegedly took his donkey cart and went all the way to Beijing to meet Mao because he was so happy that the region had been liberated. And all of these stories that actually predate the Cultural Revolution were constantly sort of being published in Youth magazine, because that's of course a story that all young people in the 1960s wanted to read. There were also other stories of Mao meeting with young women who were making dopas and being offered one of the traditional dopas. And here, what do you see on the carpet? It's a carpet right here. You see, what do you see? You see Xi Jinping accepting a dopa from a young Uyghur woman. And so we've talked about we think about what was the goal of the Cultural Revolution, right? Or what is the goal of what's happening today? I'm not sure that Mao fully understood what would happen with the Cultural Revolution. He clearly didn't fully control all of that happened, but in many ways he did get what he wanted, right? He did get back into power. He did consolidate, he died soon after, but he was able to get rid temporarily of his enemies, of his political enemies. In the region, the Cultural Revolution very much, instead of looking like a socialist revolution, looked like a colonial attempt at sort of reshaping the Uyghur people and the other minorities, right? So, but it didn't last. The effects were not necessarily were in many ways to get a lot of the local population to dislike perhaps the Communist Party more than before. But I'm not sure there were lasting effects on Uyghur culture per se. It survived, right? This sort of high period of sort of Han chauvinism, if you want to call it that. Now, I think what's happening today is a little bit different in many ways because the state is a lot more powerful, right? So one of the main differences I would say is that during the Cultural Revolution, destroying the four worlds was fairly vague, intentionally so perhaps, and there was some dissent, right, among local Beijing leadership. Today it's the state acting completely, right? Now the state does rely on people participating in this program, right? Taking the jobs as police officers, denouncing their neighbors, but the state at the local and the national level are in accordance, right? They're all in agreement about what to do in the region, or at least that's how it's perceived, right? Because there's a lot of sort of investment in creating sort of this massive surveillance state. One of the similarities between Xi Jinping and Mao, however, is sort of it seems that there's a renewal of the cult of personality. Now, other Chinese leaders have done this, right? But I think Xi Jinping is taking it to another level. In the region, for example, there were so many images of him everywhere. In bookstores, there were memoirs about his youth, like there were stories about what he did when he was a sent-down youth during the Cultural Revolution, and it was all about Xi Jinping everywhere. That was the vast majority of books that you would see when you first enter a bookstore were Xi Jinping books. Yeah, and so, and images of Xi Jinping everywhere. So I think this is in People's Park, I believe. And it seems very similar to sort of the kinds of things you would have seen during the Cultural Revolution, images of Mao everywhere. And part of this is knowing how much sort of Xi Jinping and the party love the people, right? The portrayal of the benevolent ruler. Is the picture of Itka Mosque, and as all my colleagues have said before, returning to the region was actually quite difficult in many ways because it was so different and it was so empty. In Kashgar in particular, I felt like Urumqi to me was a little more normal, though with all the construction and maybe not that normal, but Kashgar felt so empty. I had never seen this place so empty of people, and it was, as both of you said, sort of regularly empty. The Itka Mosque was the only mosque you could really go in. Other mosques, padlocked. And this is the Apak Khoja Mazri. And what do you see in the prayer hall? Is Xi Jinping shaking hands with Uyghur clerics because he is a benevolent ruler who is supportive, right, of religious freedom. That's the message they're trying to pass, but clearly that's not the case. You can't go in the prayer hall, it is padlocked as well. And okay, here is this image of Apak Khoja. I believe there were crescent moon before on top of it, right? And they're not there anymore. But I heard they bring them back sometimes, right? I think you mentioned that, Elise. So there are parallels, right, between the Cultural Revolution and what's happening today. The rhetoric seems fairly similar to you have to love the country, you have to be loyal, and how do you prove that? You modify your language. But even during the Cultural Revolution, it wasn't systematic, right? The repression, nothing was systematic. It very much varied from locale to locale. And while there is some variation today, it is systematic. Like people, Uyghurs mostly, but other Turkic minorities are systematically targeted, and arrested for no reason. So it wasn't good to be very Uyghur in 1966, and I believe it is a lot worse to be Uyghur today in 2018, regardless of what you do. Even someone who's very loyal to the party can be arrested and sent to the camp, and he disappeared. China in 1966, I'll wrap up. China in 1966 was fairly isolated, right? It was not the global power it is today, though China portrayed itself as sort of the savior for downtrodden, colonized people in the world, right? But in 2018, China is a global power, so it's also a very different kind of China. This is an image from Sairamköl outside of Hoja. I don't know, you can't see very well, but it's like maybe a moment of hope. What is it called in English? A rainbow. The beginning of a rainbow coming through, but of course there's barbed wire everywhere, even in the mountain, right? And Joanne finished on talking about Orwell, right? Because that's what, when you go to Xinjiang, that's what it seems so Orwellian. It's also Minority Report, Philip K. Dick, but it's also Margaret Atwood. So here you have all the great values that exist in Xinjiang and in Urumqi in particular. One of them is democracy. Another one is freedom. And that reminds me of Margaret Atwood, The Handmaid's Tale, where the auntie says, before you had freedom of, right, do whatever you want, freedom of religion, freedom of promiscuity. Today you have freedom from violence. And one of the things that I heard over and over when I was in the region, mostly from Han Chinese taxi drivers, to be honest, was that now Xinjiang and Urumqi is the safest place in the world. There's no place safer than Urumqi. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Professor Curtries for that very colourful and insightful comparison there. And our next speaker will be Professor Sean Roberts from GWU.
So that's a good segue to the issue of terrorism. Urumqi being the safest place in the world. Let's see, where is here we go. So I'm going to talk today about what I like to call the Uyghur terrorism narrative and how this relates to the internment camps. So briefly, kind of, I want to get a lot accomplished in a little bit of time, so just give you some things I want to mention. First of all, we know the camps were denied initially by the Chinese government, and subsequently they've been justifying them as sort of a new approach to countering violent extremism. And even though they say they're benign vocational training centers, they're also noting that they're mostly aimed at countering terrorism. So terrorism is certainly a large part of the justification. One of my arguments is that since 2001, when the Chinese government started labeling Uyghurs as a terrorist threat, it created a new targeting of this ethnic group that evolved over time into a sense where you could, in essence, create the whole ethnic group as a threat to society. And initially, when the Chinese government came out with a statement in 2001, about 6 weeks after 9/11, and said it faced this huge terrorist threat, that was a completely baseless claim. But with time, the counterterrorism strategy has in fact begun gradually with time to create some armed resistance among Uyghurs. And that, of course, leads to the Chinese state now being able to justify its counterterrorism program. But one of the things that happened as part of that is those people who've been studying this region since the 90s know that there were campaigns ongoing for a long time against separatism after the fall of the Soviet Union. And there was kind of a sudden change after 2001 where the discourse changed to anti-terrorism. So I'll leave the general argument to that, and then I'll get down to the details. First of all, I want to talk about this narrative of Uyghur terrorism. So as I mentioned, about 6 weeks after 9/11, they issued a white paper suggesting that China had been for over a decade facing a serious terrorist threat from an organized group. It was actually termed the Eastern Turkestan Forces. And I think it included many organizations that might be in this room today. They named every Western human rights group of Uyghurs in diaspora, every political group, and it named a group that a lot of scholars at the time had never heard of, called the Eastern Turkestan Islamic Movement, that was allegedly in Afghanistan. But part of the argument was that all of these groups were funded by Al-Qaeda, and all the violent activities that happened in Xinjiang throughout the 1990s, no matter what they were the work of this group. Now, I do want to lay some blame here with the West, because there was essentially a perpetuation of this narrative in the counterterrorism industry in the U.S. and in Europe. There's a lot of think tanks that, to this day, if you look up on their pages, they'll give you a description of the Eastern Turkestan Islamic movement, which matches exactly this 2001 statement from the Chinese government. And as a result, they became an echo chamber. You can still find, if you look at security studies journals, you can find articles, comparative terrorism studies, and they will name all these things from the 1990s as being acts of Uyghur terrorism without any sort of analysis.
ETIM terrorism.
Yes, ETIM terrorism. So my analysis suggests that it's a much more complex, atomized evolution of Uyghur militancy, and I'm reticent to even say Uyghur terrorism, because that depends on how one defines terrorism. So first of all, I just want to mention, when I talk about a self-fulfilling prophecy, I think this statement is very prophetic. It's from Robert Merton, a sociologist from the 1940s, who mentions a self-fulfilling prophecy is in the beginning a false definition of the situation, evoking a new behavior which makes the original false conception come true. This specious validity of the self-fulfilling prophecy perpetuates a reign of error, for the prophet will cite the actual course of events as proof that he was right from the very beginning. So the question that came earlier from the audience about Syria, retrospectively, the Chinese government can say, yes, there are Uyghurs in Syria, we face a threat. But in fact, in 2001, when this narrative began, that was not the case. And in fact, it was this narrative that created that. So let me give you a little bit of my interpretation of events. I don't consider it to be the definitive explanation of these groups. I have not been to Afghanistan or Waziristan, but using a lot of the same sources that that the terrorism specialists use when they talk about Uyghur terrorism, and doing interviews with people who are actually part of some of these groups, I've come up with very different conclusions. So first of all, it turns out that the Eastern Turkestan Islamic movement did exist. Was probably founded around 1998 by a man named Hassan Massoum, who left China in 1997. And from what I can gather, this organization was a very small organization in Afghanistan that was trying to establish training camps to train Uyghurs to fight a war of liberation in China. It's unknown how many people we're talking about, but I literally think when we talk about the organizers of this group, we're talking about a handful of people, maybe less than 10. And the people who went through these camps are also very minimal in number. Some of them ended up in Guantanamo Bay, and I've interviewed some of those who were then released from Guantanamo Bay. And they tell stories about a very poorly resourced camp that they were in that had one AK-47 that they were able to shoot once a day. And most of their time was spent on trying to renovate the abandoned building that these people had taken over. There's probably only one interview with an ETIM official who notes that throughout their period in Afghanistan, they had very bad relations with Al-Qaeda because they weren't interested at all in global jihad and were just interested in China. 2003, Hassan Massoum was killed in Pakistan. And as far as I'm concerned, ETM ceases to exist. So next time you read anything about ETIM after 2003, note that it's not about ETIM. However, out of ETIM, what happens with the people who were in the training camps and were organizing this group, they go over into Pakistan as the US invades Afghanistan. as I mentioned, Hassan Massoum's killed. At least one person survives from this group by the name of Abdul Haq. And he establishes a new organization somewhere around 2005, 2006, called the Turkestan Islamic Party. Now, most terrorism experts will talk about this as basically the same thing as ETIM, but in fact, it is not at all the same thing as ETIM. Initially, I think this person is the extent of the Turkestan Islamic Party. He's in Pakistan. He does become aligned with Al-Qaeda, and he produces some very, very nice videos, some of them that were on YouTube. The first one is about the martyrdom of Hassan Massoum. So he creates a narrative that this is a continuation of ETIM. But generally, throughout the period till 2013, really all we know about this group are videos that only have only have Abdul Haq in them. They never generally take credit for anything that happens in China. They praise things that happen in China. I've talked to people who've worked in Waziristan during this period. They never heard of any Uyghurs there. So my inclination is to believe this is a shell organization for Al-Qaeda that was trying to recruit Uyghurs to Al-Qaeda, probably with little success. And then suddenly something else happens. Beginning around 2013, we hear reports that there are thousands, maybe a couple thousand, Uyghurs in Syria, and they're fighting for the Turkestan Islamic Party. So part of the question is how this happens. I don't want to go into too much about it, but there's a mass exodus after the Urumqi riots in 2009 out of the country, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. And a lot of these people are coming through Southeast Asia, trying to get to Turkey, and through a variety of ways, we can speculate on various involvement of different organizations. These people end up in Syria, and they're unusual in that they're there with their whole families. So a couple thousand Uyghurs may mean, only 1,000 or even less men fighting, because we have people who are there with women and children as well. So that's what I think is the narrative of Uyghur terrorism and the reality of it. But I think it's the narrative that's informed what's happened since 2001 to Uyghurs inside China. So first, really there wasn't a lot of impact of changing the name to terrorism. I tried to look at this recently when I was writing an article, and you just see a lot of transposing the name, terrorism, separatism. It doesn't really make that much difference. I mean, it's right on the heels of a very big crackdown that Joanna's written a lot about after the riots in Ulja, and it's just changing the name for the most part. It is allowing more raids on illegal religious activities, more arrests for having illegal religious materials, attempts start to happen to regulate Uyghur dress. So it's starting to already take a form of focusing on cultural issues and religious issues as the source of the problem. But at the same time, at this period, 2001 to 2008, China is taking a carrot and stick approach to attracting Uyghur loyalty. Uyghurs are allowed to, or they're encouraged to go study in China. A lot of Uyghurs became wealthy during this time. So it was kind of a period where you had harsh punishment for any symbols of disloyalty, but opportunities for the loyal. And I believe that began to change in 2008, gradually, and then more after the Urumqi riots. But the Beijing Olympics, to a certain degree, was a turning point in this narrative of Uyghur terrorism, because Turkestan Islamic Party, Abdul Haq and his video camera, create a video threatening terrorist attacks at the Olympics, which never happened. But this created hysteria within China. It started, I think, also for the first time to really create a popular Islamophobia. And there was a beginning of equating the idea that Uyghurs, and especially religious Uyghurs, are dangerous. The state follows up with massive arrests of potential terrorists. During the Olympics, Uyghurs are essentially cleared out of Beijing. Uyghurs are not allowed to book hotel rooms. So there begins to be this kind of ethnic profiling at this time, and it gets much worse the next year after the Urumqi riots. And I'm not going to go into how the Urumqi riots happened, but I just will note, here's some examples of violence on both sides. It was a peaceful protest that became essentially the worst ethnic violence China's seen in modern history, where you had both Han and Uyghurs going after each other in the street. And it was kind of a boiling over of a lot of issues that were happening, but had nothing to do with terrorism. The impacts of the riots were very significant, though. There was a massive crackdown in the region. Famously, it doesn't seem as extreme now, but it seemed very extreme at the time. They cut off the internet for an entire year. They cut off all communications with the outside world for an entire year, which seemed unprecedented in the modern world, that you could do that to a region. Of course, it pales in comparison to what's happening now. But you had massive arrests and disappearances of Uyghurs, new restrictions on religion, surveillance of religious people. And I would argue the first attempt to temporarily quarantine Uyghurs, keep them inside this closed region that was shut off from the rest of the world. And there was this odd beginning of this massive exodus. And not to be too conspiratorial, but I'm increasingly wondering to what degree the Chinese state was not complicit in this, because I talked to a lot of people who went through Southeast Asia. We're talking about 10,000 Uyghurs went through Southeast Asia, mostly from rural areas, and they told me stories about random Han Chinese human trafficking people coming to their villages and saying, "Would you like to leave? I can facilitate that for you for X amount of dollars." Which it seems odd. I mean, maybe that's the way human trafficking networks work. Maybe they seek out markets, these people want to leave, but it seems odd. And there was a period, and I'm trying to track down exactly when this was, when the state suddenly started giving out passports to Uyghurs, and a lot of the Uyghurs who left in this time also left on passports, including a lot of the ones that ended up in Syria. So after this period, that's when we really start to see violence. And a couple of papers mention this. 2013, a Uyghur couple drives an SUV into Tiananmen Square. Not certainly a very symbolic attack, not a very vicious one. But then we see much more vicious attacks. We see this attack on people in the Kunming railway station, attack on Han miners in a coal mine in northern Uyghur region of China. And with each act of violence, we see increased crackdown, increased attempts to weed out terrorists, and a furtherance of this kind of equating being Uyghur, and especially religiously Uyghur, as being a terrorist. And at the same time, with each of those clampdowns, of course, you have more violence, tougher clampdowns, more violence. And that basically takes us to the present situation. When Chen Guangguo comes to power in 2016, and he starts implementing a lot of the policies from his experience in Tibet, but in many ways much more seriously. And we've already talked about a lot of this massive technological surveillance, complete invasion of privacy. And I like to think of this idea of quarantining Uyghurs in camps, where they can be either cured of their Uyghurness, Muslimness, or terrorism tendencies, which are considered all to be the same thing, or they aren't allowed to leave. Now, to answer something that somebody said earlier, there hasn't been really much reported violence since this time. So you could see this as a successful approach to counterterrorism. If you think you can quarantine a population indefinitely. And we're really seeing, and I think this goes a lot to what Jim was talking about, you're seeing this kind of final solution approach to trying to change Uyghurs' consciousness. Because if being a Uyghur, and particularly being a religious Uyghur, means that you're a terrorist, you have to shed your Uyghurness and your religiosity to be able to contribute to society. So just in conclusion, I want to mention this. I recently wrote about this in an academic context where I use Foucault, who talks about this idea of biopolitics. But for the people here, I'm not going to bore you with French social theory. But I think it's a very simple idea. I mean, we see this through the rhetoric of the Chinese government, that they are equating terrorism with sickness. And so we've seen since 2001 this gradual downslide from a carrot and stick approach, which kind of characterized the terrorism problem as a few bad apples, otherwise affecting a generally loyal, happy minority population, to something where being Uyghur, your identity, and any trace of Islam in that identity is a sign of being a terrorist. And so in many ways, Uyghurs are being framed as a biological threat to Chinese society, like a virus, and they must be either cured, quarantined, or eradicated.
Thank you very much, Professor Roberts, for that very apt application of the concept of self-fulfilling prophecy. Our final speaker is Michael Clark from Australian National University. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Joanne, and thanks to Sean as well for organising, and Munteman for some of the logistical arrangements as well, and to all the members of the Uyghur community who've come out as well. Thinking about sort of how to approach this issue, Sean said, can you cover Belt and Road in the context of this issue of the sort of mass detention concentration camps in the Uyghur homeland? And it's a little bit of a difficult task in some ways. And so I thought perhaps the best way to start is to begin with, okay, what does the Chinese government say the Belt and Road Initiative is about? So according to a number of sort of programmatic statements by Beijing, BRI is about essentially long-term infrastructure development and production and economic integration across a vast swathe of Eurasia, and also increasingly across the maritime domain of what you might term the Indo-Pacific region. There are a number of core goals that have been outlined to expand and connect transport networks and markets, disperse and improve Eurasian production capacity, facilitate transit of goods, capital, energy, resources. Core practical components of this that have been mapped out to date include 6 macroeconomic corridors, for instance the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, amongst others, and supportive multilateral institutions such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the Silk Road Fund. So if we take it on face value, doesn't this sound like a great idea? In some ways, this builds on some of China's post-Cold War diplomacy, and certainly in the 2000s, building towards Xi Jinping's idea of building a community of common destiny, as it's currently framed. This is about connectivity in China becoming a hub of the sinews of globalization. And this is held to be a positive net good for the international community. So this framing is not just about how BRI is good for China, it's also about how BRI is potentially good for the rest of the world. So BRI links in important ways, I think, in Chinese thinking, a number of key domestic and foreign policy concerns. So BRI is seen as being an engine of domestic, regional, and global development, but also, I would argue, increasingly stability. And I'll talk a little bit more about how I think the current regime in Beijing is framing that concept of stability. If we sort of drill down to a little bit more detail about the practicalities of practice of Belt and Road, we can sort of put together sort of three separate baskets of issues. One, there's geopolitical. Two, security, both domestic and in a foreign policy context. And third, economics. And each of these, I think, have certain interlinkages that make Xinjiang important and vital to the success of Belt and Road. And this is leading me to this issue of sort of what has been the burning question for some people over the last few days is, why now? Why has the Communist Party decided on this particular strategy at this moment in time? And I think we cannot divorce Belt and Road from our attempts to explain that issue. So in terms of geopolitics, there are long-standing narratives, certainly in the Chinese strategic studies and international relations community, about the necessity, as Wang Zhixi, the famous international relations scholar at Peking University, said in 2012, that BRI was essentially a necessity for China, a march westward, with the US so-called pivotal rebalance to Asia under the Obama administration. The subtext of his argument as well carried a certain domestic connotation, and central to this was about securing Xinjiang and Tibet as I suppose the continental hinterland that would enable the expansion of Chinese power and influence across its Eurasian frontiers. In the security context, those two domestic issues, Xinjiang and Tibet, were also crucially linked, certainly around this narrative that Jim Millward spoke of a bit earlier, this shifting idea about how the party could best achieve the integration of its ethnic minority populations, not just the Uyghur, but others as well. And this sort of debate about the need for a so-called second-generation Minzu policy, this idea of focusing on simply underdevelopment, for instance, or economic backwardness as being kind of a key issue to be overcome. The sort of third basket on the BRI economics, understood in sort of a much broader national and international context, has been framed by some economists as being driven by China's concerns about a post-global financial crisis slowdown in the Chinese economy, development of industrial overcapacity, certainly in the construction and heavy industrial sectors of the Chinese economy. So BRI is conceived by these scholars as really about an effort to stimulate regional demand for China's industrial overcapacity. A sort of an addendum to this, and one that links back to the geopolitical side of the equation, is of course the centrality of enhancing China's energy and resource security issues through the development of overland linkages for oil and gas pipelines and so on. And this kind of interlinkage between all these three separate baskets of issues has been acknowledged by President Xi himself. In a speech in April 2014, he stated that the long-term stability of Xinjiang is vital to the whole country's reform, development and stability. It's also important to the country's unity, ethnic harmony, national security, as well as to the great revival of the Chinese nation. So there's a lot packed in that context. So this leads me to the second part of leading towards my explanation, in a sense, about the why now issue. And this is about, I suppose, the practicalities on the ground. How has BRI played out? Both in domestic context, we've heard a lot about those issues over the past few hours, from Sean's issue about the narrative of Uyghur terrorism, the campaign for de-extremification, and so on and so forth. But I just want to reframe our focus a little bit and focus on what I've termed Belt and Road and Chinese security diplomacy, particularly in the context of Central Asia, which is, of course, a key region for the Belt and Road. And of course, as many of you are no doubt aware, China's concern here to develop constructive and strategic partnerships with the states of Central Asia, of course, dates back right to the independence of Central Asia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. However, rather than go through that entire history, I just want to touch on two key facets of that. One, in particular is the formation of the Shanghai Five group in 1996 and its subsequent transformation in June 2001 to the Shanghai Cooperation Organisation. And the trajectory of those two groupings, those two organisations, particularly the SCO, is particularly interesting from a international relations perspective, and that's my primary disciplinary background. It's interesting in the context of wider discussions about the nature of international institutions and multilateralism. So if we look at details about what the SCO actually does, in particular in the realm of counterterrorism cooperation, it reveals, I think, quite a bit, both about China's agenda in Central Asia and also what is occurring within Xinjiang itself. So the SCO can be framed primarily as a statist form of multilateralism. It's about the protection of sovereignty, borders, and regime security rather than any Western concept of national security. This is about the security of the Chinese Communist Party. And this links has linked quite well in the past with the interests of the Central Asian states for their own regime security. Many of the Central Asian states, of course, being long-term authoritarian regimes of varying intensities, if you want to frame it in that way. So how does it relate to SCO-CT cooperation? Well, there are a number of institutional developments over the years since 2001, and I'll touch on just a couple at the moment. One is the regional counterterrorism structure that was established in Tashkent in Uzbekistan in 2004. The second issue is the so-called non-asylum pledge and CT convention agreed to by the SCO states, and finally agreed to in 2009, although the negotiation process began in 2005. What's important about the CT convention and the non-asylum pledge is that there is essentially an agreement between the SCO members of so-called guaranteed extradition of individuals on shared blacklists. And this leads, importantly, into the purpose of the SCO. If we drill down into sort of two key factors about the regional counterterrorism structure and the various conventions and agreements underneath it, it tells us a lot. Firstly, the definition of terrorism that has been adopted by the SCO. It is broad and ambiguous. It defines terrorism, and I quote, as an ideology of violence that seeks to exert influence on decision-making of governments. And for those of you who are familiar with the vast literature in terrorism studies, security studies, that seems to be a very, very short discussion and definition of terrorism. The second key factor of the SCO, sort of leading on from this issue of the ambiguous definition of terrorism, is the member states are also bound by the principle under these agreements of so-called mutual recognition of acts of terrorism, regardless of the precise legal definition enforced in individual states in question. So, this therefore means, for instance, that the three evils, terrorism, separatism, and extremism, that China has embedded in the discourse of the SCO, are essentially whatever China deems them to be, regardless of the domestic law in play within the SCO member states themselves. So what's important about this? Well, there's been an attempt to employ similar strategies beyond Central Asia, so beyond that immediate geographic environment connected to Xinjiang itself. There's been that attempt to extend some of those norms and conventions that China is trying to embed. So one is this issue of guaranteed extradition. So China, and it's been well documented, has abused essentially Interpol red notices, targeting specific Uyghur activists, for instance, and others in the Uyghur diaspora community. It has also pushed for extradition agreements with a variety of states, quite a diverse group, ranging from my own state, Australia, right through to Egypt in the Middle East. The Australian government, thankfully, has held off on any finalisation of an extradition agreement with China. So this forms, I think, an under-examined aspect of both the Belt and Road and also China's security diplomacy. It's this sustained effort to embed and influence a common or shared understanding about certain norms, conventions, and crucially practices of security in the Central Asian context. And this has occurred since the late 1990s onwards. And we can see this more recently. The Chinese government has invested millions of dollars, for instance, in running training programs for SCO member state police and security personnel to come to China and learn, quote unquote, China's approach to counterterrorism. So this is a means of influencing the actions of other states in China's immediate region. The third layer that I'd like to sort of drill down into a bit more now is the Belt and Road and the potential export of the security state that China has established in Xinjiang itself. So here we have, in many ways, the intersection of foreign policy, geopolitics, and the current mass detention concentration camps of the Uyghur people in Xinjiang. So crucially, BRI, to circle all the way back to where I began, this Chinese vision of infrastructure connections, connectivity, is not necessarily simply about physical infrastructures, be they highways, pipelines, so on and so forth, but it's also about infrastructure and technology necessary to create a so-called digital Silk Road. So there's been large-scale investments by a large number of significant Chinese tech companies from Alibaba, Huawei, and ZTE, for instance, that have been encompassed under the rubric of the Belt and Road and various MOU agreements with a variety of states from Central Asia right through to the Middle East. Now, what's concerning about this is the fact that a number of those tech companies are the same companies that, and Darren spoke about this quite eloquently earlier today, have also been heavily investing in surveillance technology, artificial intelligence and so forth that underpins much of the surveillance apparatus in Xinjiang itself. So this suggests a number of things. One, obviously, many of these companies are certainly profit-driven, like many other tech companies around the world. However, the crucial difference in the Chinese context is that this meshes with a clear state interest. There was a Ministry of Public Security document released, regulation in 2015, which called for, and I quote, the creation of an omnipresent, completely connected, always on and fully controllable nationwide video surveillance network as a public safety imperative. So in some ways there's a confluence or convergence of interest here between the state and some of these Chinese tech companies. Chinese tech companies are willing to go abroad, in a sense, to use Belt and Road as a means of getting access to new markets, to essentially road test technologies that the Chinese state has and is intending to implement, not only in Xinjiang, but also throughout the rest of the country. And this is something that is, or should be, I think, deeply concerning for the international community, and certainly for states in the developed liberal world, such as Australia, the United States, and so on and so forth. For the simple fact that Beijing appears to be nurturing this tendency to export these technologies of surveillance. So, for instance, President Xi himself asserted at the August 2018 Sino-Arab Cooperation Forum that China should in fact export its model of social stability to the Arab world. So this begs an important question. What is China's model of stability that it's seeking to export as part, in a sense, of this Belt and Road initiative and agenda? Does it effectively amount to a technology-enabled authoritarianism or a neo-totalitarianism is an open question. So much of this is based on the concept of social management that underpins the social credit system. Samantha Hoffman, Jamestown Foundation, has done a great deal of work on this. She argues that social management as a concept embodies an effort to optimize interactions vertically within the Chinese Communist Party itself, horizontally between the party and various government agencies, and also holistically between the party and society, in order, and I quote, to improve governance capacity to shape, manage, and respond to social demands, which are framed in a variety of different ways. So this reflects, in some ways, I would argue, an interesting innovation on the party's behalf of the classical Maoist notion of mass line politics. So this becomes a technologically enabled version of the Maoist mass line. Frank Peake has also argued that this reflects the party's reinvention of itself over the past 2 decades as what he terms a neo-socialist one, that's defined by the combination of the continuity of its Leninist imperative to retain its leading role over the state and society, with a technocratic drive to cultivate responsible, trusting, and so-called quote-unquote high-quality citizens who inhabit an active, autonomous, and governable society. And Peake suggests that this is done, this combination of sort of a neo-socialist version with technocratic drive. This sort of key element here is the adaptation of what he terms neoliberal modes and techniques of governance. So the outcome here is not simply an old-fashioned, as Pete notes, an old-fashioned Leninist party that puts neoliberal technologies to uses that we may all be familiar with, but rather an innovative set of governmental technologies that cut right at the heart of the party state itself, serving to support, centralise, modernise and strengthen the party's Leninist leading role in society. So this very broad agenda is perhaps most practically reflected not only in what's occurring in Xinjiang, but also the slated rollout of China's social credit system, which relies on collecting and analysing metadata to shape and score individual citizens' economic and social behaviour as a means of underpinning stability and security. So the effect here is quite interesting. So the effect here is both is driven by both passive participation of individuals that are surveyed through the state's access to, for instance, personal data that could be stored on your iPhone, for instance, or your laptop, right through to the use of everyday conveniences like electronic payment systems to harvest data. It's also fueled and driven by active participation, by coercing individuals into allowing the state to monitor and punish individuals for non-compliance. So this amounts to what Human Rights Watch, Sophie Richardson was here earlier today, one of their reports I think characterised quite aptly as emblematic of a system of predictive policing, whereby monitoring an individual's social interactions, social media, physical movement and so on, enables the state to make real-time or at least near real-time assessments of their perceived threat to it at any time. And this has been well discussed by many of our previous presenters. So what's important here is that Beijing is not just using the rhetoric of the war on terror, as Sean argued just before, to justify its repression in Xinjiang, but it's also attempting, I would argue, to export its mode of counter-terrorism and more broadly its concept of security or stability abroad. So ultimately the question here is, is this a question of what has begun in Xinjiang or East Turkestan? Will it in fact stay there? Will it be confined to that domain? And I would suggest there are troubling scenarios here that suggest that it's bleeding out from that contained or quarantined, to borrow Sean's word, quarantined environment. And it's doing so in well-documented ways. So there's the technological side, and that's been documented by various scholars and certainly a number of very exceptional investigative journalists as well, writing in a variety of publications. Perhaps the less exposed part of this is the ideological and methodological approach that underpins this technological adaptation to security. So, just to conclude, to sort of bring us all the way back to the Belt and Road, where we began. In Chinese official discourse and rhetoric about Belt and Road is about openness, connectivity. Probably all seen the jingles, for instance, that you can see on YouTube. One of the recent ones, of course, borrowed the melody from the Pepsi ad from the 1970s, for instance, as a means of showcasing China's soft power. However, there's an enormous contradiction, yawning, I would argue, between the official discourse on Belt and Road and its implications and practice, both within Xinjiang, but also increasingly in Central Asia. So here you have the juxtaposition of the official discourse about openness and connectivity with what I think Darren and also Joanne defined quite nicely as the unfreedom and violent paternalism on display within the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Sort of to end on a sort of conceptual note here, Sean mentioned Foucault and his conception of biopolitics. I would suggest, in fact, that what we're dealing with here in some ways is a combination of Orwell and his dystopian vision of a technologically enabled totalitarian state, and Foucault, in the sense of Foucault's notion of panoptic power and also what he terms the technology of power of governmentality. Now, what he means by that is essentially not just the practice of what we're seeing in Xinjiang through the surveillance state, but what does the state seek to produce out of that process? So for Foucault, and this, he tracks this through, I won't bore you with the details. For him, the real issue with the state's approach to surveillance and the sort of panoptic vision of power is to reveal and to treat deviancy, which I think links us nicely back to some of this official rhetoric about Islam, for instance, being a pathology that's in need of a cure. But also, just as importantly, Foucault also stresses that for the state, it's not enough simply to reveal and treat the deviancy. You also must overcome the deviancy and produce productive citizens. So this is to have one sort of shred of hope, perhaps, from what's occurring in Xinjiang at the moment. If this kind of line of argumentation has some weight, I would suggest that the party does not want to physically eliminate the Uyghur people. It simply wants to treat deviancy that they have defined and wants to make them into productive citizens. Because ultimately, for the Chinese state, what is important to the Chinese Communist Party is that it exerts its power, its sovereign power over the population that resides within its territory. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Clark, for that very persuasive analysis of the meaning of the Belt and Road Initiative within the current system of mass detention in Xinjiang, and indeed the future ramifications of that initiative. We're going to have about 15 minutes, Sean?
Yeah, 15,
20. We're going to have about 20 minutes now for questions from the floor. Speakers are all here. We'll start with the gentleman at the back and then this gentleman here.
Yeah, I would like to follow up with Professor Clark on the Belt and Road Initiative. Edward and I were last year at a conference in Columbia University where Saskia Sasan, the author of her famous global cities concept, made a strong argument about the real reason for Rohingya Muslim genocide in Myanmar being basically the Belt and Road Initiative, right? Sort of the, or I would say the prospects, right? That the new project was bringing into the region, suddenly turning all these fairly useless lands into valuable properties, right? And so she is making the argument that behind the genocide is a purely economic interest, right, of the majority Myanmar community in this new land, right? So this is kind of, the genocide is a by-side project of the Belt and Road initiatives. And I think like this is something that we have not been speaking today about at all, right, is the economic values, right, or economic reasons of what is happening in Xinjiang. And I was wondering if you could go beyond the argument that the Chinese government is interested in turning the Uyghurs into productive Chinese citizens, and perhaps looking at the possibilities of their interests or the interest of the Han majority of taking over the valuable properties, right, in the place that now is going to be economically very strategic and important, yeah, for the region and potentially very prosperous, right? Sort of can be bringing some conspiracy from the economic perspective into this, right? Thank you.
Thank you. And one more from this gentleman here, please.
I'm an ethnic Uyghur and spent most of my adult life, not all, back there. And I listened to your presentations. I get, I probably can tell a lot of Uyghurs feeling as well that there's no, especially from the institutional level and to some extent to the individual level as well. For Uyghurs, with Uyghurs and Han ethnic Chinese people, there's only two ways that you can establish a true meaningful relationship. One is either be below them or either above them, and there has never been a relationship that we've been able to establish an equal footing. So that's something that I really would like the panelists to talk about. Thank you.
Okay, one more please, from this lady here, please.
Hi, there's this, this is related to the economy in Xinjiang. There's a sense that the Han Chinese attitude towards Xinjiang, there's this white man's burden kind of attitude, sort of, there was Go West campaign, and that now there's One Belt, One Road, and then, you know, the vocational training centers are free. We are giving so much benefits, and what do we get in return? And then wouldn't it be counterproductive for the Chinese government to continue this if they do not see any sort of meaningful, beneficial results, you know, other than just sort of security? Because harsh surveillance and that level of security also impacts Han Chinese living in Xinjiang.
Yeah, I'm sort of interested in actually combining the last question and the first question, because I think they're sort of treading similar ground. But I would sort of on the third issue. I mean, I think you make a very good point. There is a clear set of continuities and convergences between the Great Western Development Strategy in the late 1990s and some of the both practical implementation and also the rhetoric and discourse surrounding Belt and Road. Very much focused on this idea of, in a sense, China being this trend, well, Han Chinese China anyway, being sort of the transformative motor of modernisation that will bring this backward frontier region into the 21st century. So there's sort of crucial questions there around, as you know, what is the Han Chinese sort of quote-unquote ordinary person, and certainly Han Chinese business people, what are their views about the practicalities of Belt and Road? And there seems to be some suggestion that there has been a withdrawal or a removal of some segment of the Han Chinese population from the region recently as a result of the crackdown and the mass internment of a large or significant part of the local population. So this leads sort of back to the first question. So it seems, I take it you're sort of saying, is there ultimately an economic imperative behind the concentration camps? My take on this is that yes, while there is kind of there's a certain set of issues that you could sort of basket as the political economy of the camps. You know, Darren spoke about this a little bit earlier this morning. You know, the role of the tech companies, the role of construction companies. You know, they're all benefiting from this process, right? But there's also another issue to do with this, and this is again the concept of stability and security that the party has adopted. And the question I think, sorry, you asked at the end of your question, you know, is the payoff for the party of this process security? Is that enough? At this stage, I think that it is, because if you look at the trajectory of the party's approach to not only Xinjiang but also other issues to do with social stability and security nationwide, the bottom line is these two concepts of stability stability and security underpinned by social management. All right, it's how does the party best ensure that the population under its control essentially complies with its approach to governance. So Xi Jinping himself seems to have invested a great deal of his own capital within the CCP on achieving this. So in a sense, that the kind of minimum requirement is that there is quote-unquote security.
Could I answer? So on the economic question, this is kind of it's sort of a question of, you know, is Xinjiang a economic colony, right? Is it that kind of economic-based imperialism? And this argument first broke out in 1758 between Han ministers and Qianlong Emperor, and they said it's a piece of desert, we don't want it, why are you conquering us there? And he said, no, we'll get the money back in security terms, because otherwise, you know, it's dangerous. We can move our troops up there. Anyway, the emperor was wrong in that it was a continual drain on the imperial fisc. They literally sent silver from all the provinces of China out there every year for 100 years. And when they stopped after the rebellion, all hell broke loose in Xinjiang. So it required constant inputs. Now, there's outputs too, but, and I haven't tracked the numbers. Some people have gone into arguments as, is Xinjiang an eternal colony? And then you have to do these complicated comparisons, and obviously there's the oil and other petrochemicals and so on. But generally it seems that, it costs a lot of money to control this territory. It's not clear that the benefit is economic. I think it's more ideological. Security, but in the sense of the image of security, right? And then one more point on this. When we ask, well, and this is commonly said, even this is part of the Chinese propaganda, we need to repress the Uyghurs because security is necessary for Belt and Road. And even Western commentators sometimes will sort of nod along with that. But then to accept that argument, you have to accept that Xinjiang was unstable before this, right? And now we're told constantly that 21 months ago, Xinjiang was hell on earth, right? But if you go back and read, Xinjiang Verbal from 22 months ago, they're talking about how great everything is, right? So I think the stability, obviously Sean gave us some good examples of what was going on, but these are not existential threats. These are small things. They are threats to the legitimacy of the Communist Party vis-a-vis Han in particular, right? Because their job is to protect them from these restless minorities, right? So I think it's a political threat. It's not a real security threat, but they're pouring money in for political reasons.
And I'll just add my 2 cents on this, because I differ a little bit with you guys. And it might be the fact that, coming from my experience in Central Asia, I've long made the argument that until Deng Xiaoping took over, Xinjiang was viewed as a buffer zone, right, as a security zone. And as a result, actually, what you were talking about, Jim, there hasn't been a lot of sinification. There wasn't up until that period. But after the reform period, I think there has been a pretty consistent view that this is an area of opportunity. Particularly with the fall of the Soviet Union, it becomes an entry point for a lot of economic activity. So I often argue against people who talk about the natural resources of the region itself, because those aren't probably not that important. But accessing the natural resources of Central Asia and the Middle East require going through Xinjiang.
So the conduit is necessary, but that conduit was never shut, right? When was the conduit shut? They can control the rail lines and the roads and that sort of thing. It's not like building a new one's going to be any harder to control.
Yeah.
Okay, can I take another 3 questions, please? Can I ask you to keep your questions short and neat and concise to maximise the time we've got left? So, the lady at the back there, the gentleman at the front here, and the gentleman there, please.
Hi, I'm Jinlin from Freedom House. I have a question. You all mentioned a lot of Chinese discourse on how to undermine the Uyghurs movement, and as a Taiwanese myself, I feel like the most sensitive elements in both Taiwan, Hong Kong, Tibet, or Uyghur movement is the separatism element. I like to call it self-determination. I understand how international advocacy and international community cannot address those kind of problems for the diaspora network or for the local groups because it's a national issue, and also, of course, with nowadays people addressing how United Front is imposing Chinese influence in other countries, it's really difficult to point a finger at them saying that, oh, you should, like, talking about those kind of sensitive issues. But my question is, CCP is also using those kind of discourse to further block those kind of diaspora movement. For example, in a recent UPR review, they actually took down Tibetan and Hong Kong civil groups quote just because they have they mentioned something similar to self-determination on their website. So my question is, are we walking into a CCP trap of discourse? Because I feel like without addressing those kind of problems, it gives CCP further leverage to not having international community not influencing my ethnical problem. So my question to the panelists is whether this discourse is still effective.
David on spot, no affiliation. I'm just wondering if you know if China's provided any justification for its treatment of the Uyghurs by saying that China's not doing anything differently than the United States, Australia, and Canada did to their indigenous population up in the 1970s. Thank you.
Yes, David Abramson, State Department, Georgetown University. My question, you've raised a number of issues about the end goal, potential end goals of these policies from Beijing. And if one of the goals is development leads to security or stability, then the development would presumably need to involve economic inclusion of minorities in Xinjiang. But I'm wondering if you're aware of any of Beijing's, how much they're considering, if this is one of the end goals, whether they're considering the ways in which how business is conducted that excludes minorities, how is turning them into Chinese citizens through re-education, etc., going to lead to that product? Or is this not really the reason?
Let me answer those three first.
Let me just start with, because two of the questions, actually all three to a certain degree, were making me think of the indigenous peoples discourse, which is an international discourse. There's a UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that does formulate an international precedent for the idea of self-determination without getting into this issue of separatism, right? And I think, certainly, as you brought up, the Chinese government has mentioned several times, well, this is, at least the 50 Cent Army has mentioned in comments to things I've written, this is just what you guys did to the Native Americans in the 19th century. And I think that is relevant. I think that, looking at this as a problem of indigenous people, in particular when we're talking about development, most of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is focused on development issues, that development in a region where people are the indigenous population should be very inclusive of the local population. In fact, that the local population should be driving development. However, I think part of the problem is, the Chinese government's approach to development is almost, an extreme version of modernization theory from the 1960s, in this idea that if you just drive massive infrastructure, massive modernization from the top down, that's going to lead to all boats rising up, which I think has been proven to be a false theory. But I think that that's where they're operating from. And unfortunately, for a long time, I was looking into this issue of the indigenous peoples discourse in the hopes that it would be something that the Chinese government might be able to understand that is not focused on separatism. But the situation we're in right now is such that I'm afraid it's almost too late to even start that kind of discussion with the Chinese government.
So I believe, China is a signatory of the UN resolution.
Yes.
The United States, Canada, Australia are not signatories.
Yes.
And the other difference is that China has no indigenous peoples. You have to be an imperialist power to have had indigenous peoples, apparently. And so they've defined a way, they've defined their population in such a way that they have no indigenous peoples, therefore they can sign on to the resolution without it having any impact. So it's an interesting discourse, but I think they're just kind of, Are we moving on to the next question, or could I?
Sure.
Sorry, I'm talking too much. In answer to David Abrams' question or attempt to that, I think you're thinking in far too sophisticated and holistic terms about this policy. I think it's important to remember how regional level, provincial level politics works in China. And your main job is to follow whatever the primary mandates are from the center. If you're in a central Chinese province, it used to be to raise GDP of the province. Now it's to raise GDP without crashing the environment. If you're in Tibet or Xinjiang, it's to not let stuff happen. That's job number one. Chen Trengor clearly was good at that. That's why he went in. And meanwhile, in fulfilling that mandate, then your own star rises and you move up in the system. So I think that calculus is driving a lot of this at the Xinjiang level, and combined with growing authoritarianism, which means that no one now dares anywhere in China to say, wait a minute, this is probably not a good idea, right? There are people in China, academics, think tanks who a few years ago were arguing against the Islamophobic policies, even in like the pages of Western papers. They're talking to Western reporters. They've shut up for the last few years. Nobody can say boo.
Okay, did someone want to respond to the lady at the back?
So the Chinese influence sort of issue. I'm actually glad that that's been brought up. Simply because of the fact that there has been a lot of discussion, certainly in my country, in Australia, about Chinese so-called influence operations, in particular this concept of information warfare, in particular, which seems to me to be pretty pertinent to your question. It's about shaping narratives, shaping discourse. So the strategy of the so-called three warfares, which is what the Chinese approach to information warfare is based on three things: psychological warfare, media or public opinion warfare, and legal warfare. Now, all of these things, and some Western scholars have done work on this, that these have been deployed with respect to Taiwan, with respect to the South China Sea, for instance. But I would argue, and am arguing in a paper that's currently under review and hopefully it's published, that each of those three processes, those three strategies, have been undertaken with respect to Xinjiang, and in particular with respect to Uyghur quote-unquote terrorism, where you have the deployment of certain narratives, both internally and externally. So internally, the most important ones concern new legislation and regulations. So, for instance, the 2015 counter-terrorism legislation as well, which for the first time detailed a specific definition of terrorism, a very broad and ambiguous one, that the Chinese authorities could use to deploy against various elements of unrest or deviancy as how they may define it. Internationally, though, if you track some of the English language websites of Xinhua, Global Times, and so forth, they often, quite regularly now, carry pieces that specifically speak to key issues. So, for instance, the indigenous population one, also so-called Western double standards on terrorism, for instance. That's been a recurring one. So the first one that I recall seeing came after the Urumqi events in 2009. I think it was a month after that. There was a Xinhua or Global Times English language editorial accompanied by a cartoon as well, which basically suggested the West has no legs to stand on here. They've used or instrumentalized the threat of Islamic terrorism for pursuit of security or other political interests. So this has been an ongoing process with respect to Xinjiang. So I think you're absolutely right to put your finger on it, yet we shouldn't just be focused on it in that foreign policy, geostrategic context, because it's actually relevant to some of these key issues within China itself.
Okay, we have maybe a minute left. I'm just going to stick with the gentleman who had his hand up last time. He was sitting here, and I'm sorry, you'll have to save the rest for the 5-minute break we'll take after that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Kevin Dick. I'm a PhD student in the history department at Johns Hopkins. I have a quick question. If the economic and security rationales for the current crisis in Xinjiang are not entirely satisfying, as seems to be the sentiment of the panel right now, then is perhaps the missing piece an understanding of the particular political philosophy and ideology of Xi Jinping in understanding this? Is that what really gets us to a more comprehensive understanding about why such a radical shift in these kinds of transformative assimilationist policies and incarcerations are taking place? Thank you.
Sure, I'll have a stab at that one. I think it's a really excellent question, because if we're looking at kind of levels of analysis here, you know, structural conditions, domestic, we're looking at the question of agency here. You know, how important is the political leadership, and in particular embodied in President Xi himself, who is, you know, as we know, is the so-called core leader now, from which everything appears to flow. So there's been some discussion around this issue. So there's John Garno, Richard McGregor at the Lowy Institute, and sorry, that scholar, his name escapes me at the moment, who've done quite a bit of work on this issue of, you know, can we actually talk about defining kind of an operational or set of operational codes in sort of political psychological terms for Xi Jinping's worldview, for instance, as it relates to domestic politics, security, and also foreign policy. And there's something particularly interesting here about, I think, the way in which, or certainly the way in which publicly available materials relate President Xi's supposed lessons that he learned from sort of key moments in his political trajectory. So one is the Cultural Revolution, you know, the experience of being a sent-down youth in the countryside. And the other important one is the lessons he has apparently drawn from Tiananmen in '89 and the collapse of the Soviet Union in '91. So the formal one, so his experience in the Cultural Revolution, the consensus seems to be somewhat counterintuitive. That he views the Cultural Revolution as reinforcing the need for strict party discipline, hierarchy and decision making and so on, which in the context of what we know about the Cultural Revolution does seem a little bit counterintuitive. But it seems, at least partly, I think, to explain what appears to be Xi's obsession with stability or security, however we want to define it. The lessons learned from '89 and '91, however, that, again, this is only speaking from what I've seen in the publicly available comment and analysis of Xi's thinking. There was a Chris Buckley, the New York Times journalist, and John Garno, and Richard McGregor as well, both used this example. So Xi, just upon coming to power, supposedly gave a so-called secret speech on a party discipline tour in Guangzhou, I think might have been early 2014 or late 2013, where he detailed, and some of this was leaked, or at least transcribed to the press. And in it, he maps out the lessons of '89 and '91, which essentially amounts to, one, Soviet Union collapsed because Gorbachev wasn't man enough, and this is interesting where you bring his concept, talk about gender politics as well, these concepts of masculinity as well, that no one was man enough to stand up and defend the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The other one, in terms of a similar issue with 1989, is the lesson learned there was the party was able to deploy violence, repression successfully. So I think there is connections between each of those sort of three data points, but admittedly we don't have all the information. It's not like someone's been able to sit down with President Xi and do an in-depth interview, for instance, on those issues. But I think there's something there.
Very quickly, there's a music video, a rap music video about the becoming relatives program, right, with Han Katters being sent into Uyghur villages. You have to look it up in Chinese, Jiaqin, I don't know, Shipin or something like that. But it's worth seeing. But the lyrics of this song are all about how let's go down to the villages so we can relive the revolutionary spirit of Xi Jinping when he was down in the village in the Cultural Revolution. And this is against the backdrop of pictures of all the Han going into the village. We saw some earlier, but they're carrying their backpacks, they're wearing hiking boots, like they're going for an extended camping trip, clearly roughing it out, in the rural hinterlands. So there's linkage at that ideological level, I think, between Cultural Revolution experience, developmentalism, paternalism, all of these kind of things we can see in the treatment of the Uyghurs now.
And I will quickly add, during the Cultural Revolution, the youth also wanted to relive what Mao and all the revolutionaries had experienced, right? So they all went on a long march, right? A slightly different one, because they didn't have the Golden Dawn fighting them, but it's fairly interesting to see all these parallels. And one of the person over there mentioned, the sort of the colonialist, imperialist attitudes, the white man's burden. I think they don't even use at the end. And that's not new, it's not from the 1990s. I think you see that already from in the 1950s, though it's not as like aggressive. I would say that since in the 1990s, but in the 1950s there was a lot of campaigns to convince young Han Chinese to move to Xinjiang, also again in the 1960s, and part of it was to develop, but also to teach the local population how to be better communists.
Okay, thank you very much to all of our panelists. And Sean, should we take a 5-minute toilet break?
We'll take a 5-minute break, and then we're going to have a fairly informal roundtable. I hope I can talk the rest of the scholars here. I know they have a couple who are leaving to catch planes. And we can just have a short discussion, and then also open up some discussion to the